Story 1. The rhythm of rural life, farming, food, and family in the 1880s. Imagine waking up in America in the 1880s, long before the hum of machinery, the glow of electric light, or the buzz of a car passing by your window. Instead, you would most likely rise with the sun, stirred not by an alarm clock, but by the crow of a rooster or the creak of the farmhouse settling in the cool dawn air. In this era, most Americans lived in rural settings. The United States was still largely an agrarian society, though industry and cities were growing at a remarkable pace. The census of 1880 revealed that more than half of the population lived in farming communities. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were swelling. Yet, for the average American, life was measured not in streetcars and tenements, but in furrows of soil, in the number of eggs gathered, in the steady rhythm of a plow drawn across fields. A farmhouse in the 1880s was simple but functional, built of wood or sometimes brick in wealthier areas. It centered around the kitchen, where a cast-iron stove burned steadily during waking hours. Heat in winter came from wood chopped and stacked the previous summer. A family might wake to the faint smell of ashes in the hearth, or the lingering scent of bacon grease from yesterday's breakfast, though photography was still expensive enough that a single portrait could be a prized possession. The work of the day began early. For men and older boys, this meant heading to the barn to feed animals. Chickens needed scattering of corn. Cows needed milking. Horses, the great beasts of burden, required grooming, feeding, and readiness for the fields. The chores were repetitive, sometimes dull, but absolutely essential. A missed feeding or neglected milking could mean loss of income or even starvation. Livestock provided not just food, but in many cases a form of savings. An extra cow or pig could be sold if a debt came due, or if a poor harvest strained the household budget. For women and girls, the morning's work often started in the kitchen. Bread had to be baked daily, and this was no quick process. Flour was sifted, dough kneaded by hand, and loaves placed into the stove, all while breakfast was prepared for the family. Breakfast itself was hearty, for the day's labor required fuel, eggs, fried ham or salt pork, fresh milk or buttermilk, and biscuits were common. Coffee, though more expensive, was often present, sweetened with molasses if sugar was too dear. Children, even before school, might be set to work, churning butter, fetching water from the well, or gathering kindling for the stove, the very rhythm of life in the 1880s. Farm household was shaped by necessity. Every season dictated different labors. Spring was a time of planting, when entire families worked from dawn until dusk to lay seed into the soil. Summer was filled with maintenance, cultivating, hoeing weeds, tending livestock, and praying for rain. Autumn was the busiest time of all, a season of harvest, when neighbors sometimes joined forces to bring in wheat, corn, or hay before frost ruined the yield. Winter, though less demanding in the fields, was hardly idle. Livestock required care every day, and the family focused on preserving food, mending tools, and sewing clothing to prepare for the next year. Tools in the 1880s were a mixture of old and new. The steel plow, perfected decades earlier by John Deere, had revolutionized breaking tough prairie sod. Mechanical reapers, threshers, and seed drills were beginning to appear, though smaller farmers often could not afford them. Instead, many relied on hand tools, scythes, sickles, and hoes that demanded endless physical labor. Horses were still the primary source of power, pulling wagons, harrows, and plows. But steam engines were slowly making their way into rural America, used to power threshing machines in more prosperous regions. For most farmers, though, the work was backbreaking, repetitive, and slow. The isolation of farm life was striking by modern standards. Neighbors might live miles away, reached by dirt roads that became impassable with rain. Trips to town were rare, often once a week or even once a month, depending on the weather and the distance. The general store served as the link to the wider world, where families could buy salt, sugar, cloth, or tools. In some towns, a post office was tucked into a store or someone's front room, where letters and newspapers arrived irregularly, carried by rail or stagecoach. News was slow, often weeks out of date by the time it reached the farmstead. And yet, despite this isolation, families were rarely idle. Children had chores from the moment they could walk, steadily feeding chickens, weeding gardens, hauling water, or gathering eggs. Education was often fit around farm work. One-room schoolhouses dotted the countryside, but during planting or harvest, children might be kept at home to lend their small hands to big tasks. In this sense, the rhythm of rural life was communal and relentless. Every member of the family contributed to survival. Meals punctuated the day, and they reflected both the abundance and limits of farm life. In many regions, diets were heavy in cornmeal, pork, beans, and potatoes. Vegetables were seasonal, though families who had the means canned or pickled them for winter. Fruit was a treat, eaten fresh in summer or dried and stored. Meat was salted, smoked, or stored in a root cellar. The variety we take for granted today, exotic spices, tropical fruits, processed snacks, was unimaginable for most families in the 1880s. A farmer in Nebraska might never taste an orange in his lifetime. Religion played a quiet but powerful role in daily life. Sunday was often the one day of respite from labor, though even then, chores could not be entirely neglected. Families traveled, sometimes by wagon for hours, to reach a church where the service was as much a social gathering as a spiritual one. Sermons were long and solemn, emphasizing moral discipline, the value of hard work, and the ever-present possibility of death in an age when accidents and illnesses were common. Life expectancy in the 1880s was short by our standards, around 44 men and 42 for women, though those numbers are skewed by high infant mortality. Families were large, with many children, not just because of the lack of birth control, but because more hands were needed to work the farm. Yet death was familiar. It might come from disease, from a farm accident, or from complications of childbirth. Funerals were somber, but also community events, reminders of the fragility of rural life. Despite the hardships, many who lived through the 1880s remembered it with a kind of stoic fondness. There was dignity in labor, in seeing the tangible results of one's work at the end of a long day. The fields tilled, the barn built, the butter churned. Each task, while dull in repetition, carried the weight of survival. And in those long days of steady effort, there was also a slower rhythm to life, a patience enforced by the pace of seasons, not by clocks or machines. But this rhythm of rural life was not unchanging. By the 1880s, America was already shifting. Railroads were cutting through farmland, linking once isolated towns to cities. Factories in the east were drawing workers from the countryside, and new technologies promised to lighten farm labor while also reshaping it entirely. Rural America, for all its stability, was on the edge of transformation. And so the question lingers, for the ordinary family working their land in the 1880s, did the rise of machines and markets bring liberation from endless toil, or did it mark the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one tied not to weather and soil, but to distant forces of industry and commerce? Life in rural America during the 1880s was never easy. Behind the romantic images of wide-open fields, red barns, and golden harvests lay an existence marked by constant labor, frequent uncertainty, and daily struggles that tested both body and spirit. And yet, woven into those hardships was a thread of resilience that defined the people who lived through them. The most immediate and ever-present challenge was the weather. Farming, no matter how skilled, was at the mercy of the skies. This spring, frost could wipe out newly planted crops. A summer drought could wither fields of corn to brown stalks. A hailstorm could destroy a wheat harvest in an afternoon. Floods, tornadoes, and prairie fires were not rare events. They were looming possibilities that shaped the way farmers thought about every season. Families told stories of dust storms that rolled in like walls of brown haze, blotting out the sun and leaving fields unrecognizable. Others recalled the sound of locusts, those swarms of grasshoppers that could descend and devour acres of grain within hours. Such events were devastating, not only because they meant hunger, but because they left farmers unable to pay debts. A single bad season could put a family behind for years. Banks and merchants, often unsympathetic, demanded payment regardless of circumstances. Some families lost their farms altogether, forced to move or take work as tenants on land that had once been their own. The dream of independence, so central to the rural ethos, was fragile and easily undone. Yet hardship was not always catastrophic. More often, it came in the form of endless small burdens. Fetching water in the dead of winter, when wells froze and buckets had to be broken free of ice. Milking cows in barns with floors covered in frozen mud, hands aching from the cold. Sewing until candlelight blurred the eyes because children needed warm clothes for school. Nursing a sick child through the night with only home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, and prayers because the nearest doctor was miles away and travel was impossible in snow or mud. Illness loomed as one of the greatest threats. Diseases we now consider minor could be deadly. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid, and influenza swept through communities, sometimes taking multiple children from a single family. Rural cemeteries filled with small gravestones marked with lambs or crosses, reminders of lives cut short. Mothers faced mortal danger in childbirth, and accidents, farm equipment injuries, falls from horses, burns from stoves were constant. Risks. Without antibiotics, sterile surgical practices, or advanced medicine, survival often came down to luck and endurance. Despite these struggles, or perhaps because of them, resilience became second nature. Families learned to rely on one another and on their communities. When a barn burned down, neighbors gathered for a barn raising, bringing lumber, tools, and labor to rebuild. When a family fell ill, Others brought food, milk, or simply company. These bonds of mutual aid helped people withstand the unpredictability of rural life. Hardship was never faced entirely alone, even in the most isolated regions. Resilience also took the form of resourcefulness. Farm families were experts at making do with what they had. Old clothing was patched and repatched, then turned into quilts or rag rugs when no longer wearable. Bones from Sunday dinner became broth. Ashes from the stove were used to make lye soap. Corn husks were woven into mats. Few things were wasted, for everything had a potential second life. Children grew up with an instinct for thrift that shaped their habits well into adulthood. This resourcefulness was reflected in the way families approached leisure, too. Entertainment was modest but meaningful. A fiddle played by lamplight, a game of checkers, or a gathering for a spelling bee at the schoolhouse provided joy in lives otherwise dominated by work. County fairs, with their contests, rides, and exhibitions, offered rare moments of excitement. Even reading aloud in the evenings, often from the Bible or newspapers, was a cherished ritual, connecting family members through stories and shared knowledge. The endurance of rural families was also tied to their sense of faith. Churches anchored communities not only in religion but in social life. A church picnic might be one of the few opportunities for families to socialize outside of labor. Sermons, though stern, provided comfort in affirming that suffering was part of a larger divine plan. For many, faith gave strength when reason offered little hope. Children who worked as hard as adults were themselves symbols of resilience. They rose before dawn to do chores, walked miles to school, and often sacrificed their education to help at harvest. Yet they also played making toys from sticks, sledding on hills in winter, or playing baseball with handmade balls. Their laughter carried across fields, reminding families that life contained more than toil. The endurance of women deserves particular attention. While men labored in the fields, women held the household together, balancing endless tasks: cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening, child-rearing, and often dairy work like butter churning or cheese making. They managed budgets, stretched supplies, and taught children. Their work was constant. Diaries from the time often reflect exhaustion, but also a quiet pride in managing a household despite hardship. Resilience, however, was not only personal, it was cultural. In the 1880s, rural America was forging traditions that would later be celebrated as part of the nation's identity. The image of the hardworking, self-sufficient farmer became central to political rhetoric and cultural ideals. Politicians praised the yeoman farmer as the backbone of democracy, while writers and artists depicted rural life as pure and virtuous, even if reality was harsher. This idealization sometimes obscured the difficulties, but it also elevated the dignity of rural endurance. By the close of the decade, the pressures of modernization, debt, and political discontent were beginning to build. Farmers were not passive. In the face of struggle, they organized, first in local granges and cooperatives, and later in larger political movements. These groups demanded fairer railroad rates, government regulation of banks, and policies to protect the interests of small farmers. Out of hardship grew activism, and out of resilience grew voices that would shape the politics of the 1890s. But for the families themselves, life remained a matter of survival, day by day, season by season. They planted when the soil warmed, prayed for rain in summer, harvested in autumn, and endured the long winters. They bore losses with dignity, celebrated small victories, and passed on to their children not only land, but also lessons in endurance, thrift, and perseverance. To us today, looking back, their lives might seem impossibly hard, stripped of conveniences we take for granted. Yet their resilience was extraordinary. They lived without electricity, indoor plumbing, or modern medicine, and still they managed to build communities, raise families, and create a foundation for the rapidly changing nation that America was becoming. And so, as we reflect on the hardships and resilience of rural life in the 1880s, one wonders, was it the struggle itself that forged such strength of character? Or was resilience an inheritance passed down from generations who had endured the frontier, the revolution, and the hardships of building a new nation? If the first part of rural life in the 1880s was defined by its rhythms, sunrise, chores, meals, and seasons, the second was increasingly shaped by something much larger: the encroachment of technology, commerce, and national markets into what had once been a mostly self-contained world. By the 1880s, the railroad was no longer a novelty. The Great Transcontinental Line, completed in 1869, had already demonstrated the power of steel tracks to bind vast stretches of the United States into something resembling a single economy. But in the years that followed, the expansion of railroads was nothing short of explosive. Branch lines reached deep into rural regions, stitching together farm towns in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and beyond. Where once a farmer might have relied only on local markets, now his wheat or corn could, in theory, end up in Chicago, New York, or even across the Atlantic. This changed everything. A wagon ride of 10 or 20 miles might connect a farmer's harvest to a small depot, and from there, rail cars would carry it hundreds of miles to bustling grain elevators in Chicago. These elevators, massive wooden or steel structures along the Great Lakes, could store grain in bulk before shipping it eastward or loading it onto vessels bound for Europe. By the 1880s, American wheat was feeding not just Americans, but also people in Britain and Germany. What had once been a localized existence was now tied to a world market. But this opportunity came with risk. Prices were set not on the farm, but in distant cities, at the Chicago Board of Trade or in London's markets. A farmer might labor from dawn to dusk, only to discover that this year's prices had collapsed because of bumper harvests in Russia or Argentina. The sense of control over one's life, already precarious in a world of droughts, pests, and storms, became even more uncertain. Many farmers resented what they called railroad monopolies and grain elevator thieves, who seemed to profit from their labor while they struggled to keep afloat. Railroads themselves were both a blessing and a curse. They brought goods into rural communities, manufactured tools, cloth, kerosene lamps, even exotic items like coffee beans and canned sardines, but they also charged steep rates for hauling crops out. The rates were often discriminatory, favoring large shippers over small farmers. A family farmer moving a few dozen bushels of wheat might pay far more proportionally than a large commercial farm shipping hundreds. This fueled growing discontent and gave rise to farmer-led movements like the Grange and later the Populist Party which demanded regulation of railroads and fairer economic practices. Technology, too, was creeping into the countryside. By the 1880s, mechanical reapers, invented earlier in the century by Cyrus McCormick, were more widely available. These machines allowed one man to harvest many times what could be cut by hand with a scythe. Threshing machines, often powered by portable steam engines, could separate grain from chaff with astonishing speed compared to the old flail and winnowing methods. Even seed drills, designed to plant crops in neat, evenly spaced rows, were becoming common on larger farms. Yet these innovations came at a cost. Few families could afford to purchase such equipment outright. Instead, they went into debt, borrowing money from banks or local merchants in hopes that a good harvest would allow them to repay the loans. When prices fell or when drought or blight struck, the debt remained, pulling many into cycles of poverty that were difficult to escape. Some adapted by pooling resources. In many communities, neighbors would gather for threshing bees, where one steam-powered thresher would travel from farm to farm, and everyone would lend their labor to help one another. These gatherings were practical, but also social moments, when the isolation of rural life gave way to shared meals, laughter, and conversation. Women prepared vast spreads of food to feed the workers, pies, stews, bread, and fresh butter laid out in abundance. For a day or two, the toil felt lighter when borne together. Markets did not just affect crops. Livestock, too, became tied to the growing network of railroads. Cattle and hogs, once driven on foot along dusty trails to local butchers, could now be shipped in rail cars to Chicago's Union stockyards, where they were processed in enormous slaughterhouses. The scale was staggering to rural eyes. Packing plants processed thousands of animals in a single day, turning them into standardized cuts of meat that could be sent eastward in refrigerated rail cars. For the small farmer, this meant competition on an entirely new scale, and yet it also meant access to markets that could bring greater profit if prices held. Daily life reflected these changes in subtle ways. A family that once produced most of what it consumed now found itself purchasing more goods from the store. Flour milled in a distant city, fabric woven in New England, canned peaches from California. Catalogs, most famously those of Sears Roebuck and Company, began to arrive in rural mailboxes in the late 1880s, promising an almost magical variety of goods, everything from kitchen stoves to musical instruments. Suddenly, even in a remote farmhouse, one could imagine ordering a parlor organ or a bolt of silk, shipped by rail and delivered through the local post office. Yet, with these changes came a quiet unease. Farmers, who had long lived by the cycle of seasons, now found themselves increasingly at the mercy of abstract forces. Rail rates, interest payments, grain prices set in cities they had never seen. The stability of rural rhythms was slowly eroding, replaced by the unpredictability of national and international markets. Still, not all was struggle. Some farmers prospered, especially those with larger tracts of land, who could invest in the latest machinery and weather the ups and downs of prices. Agricultural fairs, popular throughout the 1880s, showcased new inventions, prize livestock, and the bounty of harvests, reflecting both pride and progress. At these fairs, families mingled, exchanged knowledge, and took comfort in the sense of belonging to a larger community of farmers The household itself bore the marks of these changes. While women continued to shoulder the heavy burdens of cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, store-bought items slowly eased some tasks. Sewing machines, increasingly affordable, allowed clothing to be made faster. Kerosene lamps, purchased cheaply, provided brighter, steadier light than candles. Cast-iron stoves, improved by manufacturers, gave more control over cooking than open hearths. These were small conveniences, but in the unending labor of rural life, they mattered. And yet, the paradox of the 1880s was that while technology promised relief, it often demanded more work. A new machine might harvest more grain, but it also meant planting more acres to pay for it. Brighter lamps extended the hours one might work or sew into the evening. Improved stoves required constant fuel, which meant more chopping and hauling of wood. Life, in many ways, grew busier rather than easier. Religious and social life also reflected the shift toward greater connection with the outside world. Missionary societies raised funds not only for local causes but also for distant lands. Newspapers carried stories from cities and even foreign countries, linking the farmstead to events unfolding far away. Still, Sunday remained sacred as both a day of worship and of rest, a reminder that amidst all change, the fundamental rhythms of life, the need for faith, community, and reflection remained steady. But beneath these visible patterns lay a growing tension. Farmers, once proud of their independence, began to feel trapped by forces they could not control. As debts mounted and railroads seemed to dictate terms, resentment simmered. This would eventually give rise to organized protests and political movements in the following decade, as ordinary rural Americans sought to assert their rights in an industrializing nation. For now, in the 1880s, they carried on. They plowed fields, tended livestock, sewed clothing, and read newspapers by kerosene light, balancing the old rhythms of farm life with the new demands of a changing world. Theirs was a life both stable and uncertain, rooted in soil but tied increasingly to steel rails and distant markets. And so the question arises: as the family farm became more enmeshed in the machinery of industry and commerce, was rural America preserving its way of life for quietly losing it, one shipment, one debt, one catalog order at a time? Story 2. The quiet rise of the railroads. How steel tracks shaped daily life by the 1880s. The sound of the locomotive whistle had become one of the most familiar and yet transformative sounds in America. It echoed across farmland, rolled over prairies, and drifted into cities, signaling both connection and change. Though railroads had already been in operation for decades, the 1880s marked a period when they became not just feats of engineering, but threads that stitched together daily life in ways so quiet and steady that many barely noticed the extent of their impact. To grasp what the railroad meant in the 1880s, one must imagine the contrast between the world before its dominance and the world it created. Before the spread of iron rails, moving goods across long distances was slow and costly. Wagons bumped over rutted dirt roads, steamboats plied rivers only when water levels permitted, and most communities remained relatively self-contained. Travel that took weeks on horseback could, by the 1880s, be accomplished in days or even hours by rail. What had once been distant now felt attainable. By the time the census of 1880 was recorded. The United States boasted nearly 93,000 miles of track, stretching from coast to coast and threading into countless small towns. The main transcontinental line had been completed in 1869, but in the following decade, branch lines proliferated, ensuring that even modest communities in the Midwest or the South could be linked to regional hubs. For many Americans, their nearest rail depot became the focal point of interaction with the wider world. The depot itself was often a modest wooden building, painted in plain colors, with a platform extending toward the tracks. Inside, a waiting room offered wooden benches, a potbelly stove, and perhaps a bulletin board tacked with notices. A telegraph operator, sitting at a small desk with wires humming above, provided both communication and coordination. Freight sheds stored crates of goods waiting to be loaded or collected. For rural families, the depot was a place of anticipation and changed the point at which letters arrived. Travelers departed, and goods from distant cities appeared as if by magic. The arrival of the train was a sensory experience. Children gathered to watch, covering their ears as the whistle shrieked. The ground trembled as the engine approached, its smokestack belching black coal smoke into the air. Wheels screeched against rails, sparks sometimes flying, as the locomotive slowed to a halt. Passengers disembarked with satchels and trunks. Crates were unloaded by porters. Mailbags were tossed onto carts. Within minutes, the train would be off again, a roar of steam and iron fading into the distance, leaving behind both smoke and a renewed sense of connection. The railroad reshaped daily life in practical but profound ways. For farmers, it meant that crops could now be sold not just in local markets, but across the country. Wheat from Kansas could be shipped to Chicago in days, milled into flour, and sent onward to New York, or even exported to Europe. Livestock could be loaded into specialized cars and carried to urban slaughterhouses, processed and shipped back as neatly packaged cuts of meat. This circulation tied rural labor to urban appetites, integrating Americans into a national economy. For towns, the railroad brought growth. Communities with depots often flourished, attracting businesses, hotels, and general stores to serve both travelers and locals. Conversely, towns bypassed by the rails often languished, their populations dwindling as trade and opportunity passed them by. People of the era spoke of railroad towns and dead towns, their fates determined by the placement of steel tracks. The railroad also shaped time itself. Before its dominance, towns and cities set their clocks by the sun, resulting in a patchwork of local times. Noon in one town might differ from noon in another by several minutes, depending on longitude. This was manageable in an era of local travel, but chaotic when trains had to maintain schedules across long distances. In 1883, the railroads implemented standard time, dividing the country into 4 time zones: Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Though not immediately adopted by the government, the system quickly became the norm, aligning the rhythms of life across vast regions. What had been a local solar measure of time became a standardized mechanical one, and daily life adjusted accordingly. For passengers, the railroad offered both opportunities and challenges. A trip from St. Louis to Chicago, once a demanding journey of days, could now be accomplished in less than 12 hours by train. Immigrants arriving in New York could travel westward within a week, reaching new homesteads on the frontier. Families, separated by hundreds of miles, could now visit each other with relative ease. Yet comfort was not always guaranteed. Passenger cars were often cramped, smoky, and noisy. Wooden benches could grow unbearable over long rides, and the soot from coal often clung to clothing and skin. Only the wealthier could afford the luxury of Pullman sleeping cars, with upholstered seats, curtained berths, and attendants to provide service. The railroad also carried dangers. Accidents, though less frequent than in the earliest days, were not uncommon. Derailments, boiler explosions, and collisions filled newspaper columns with grim stories. Safety standards were uneven, and brakemen often performed perilous work atop moving cars, risking life and limb. Still, for most Americans, the benefits of speed and connection outweighed the risks. Beyond practicality, the railroad carried a symbolic weight. It was the embodiment of progress, of human ingenuity stretching across a continent. Politicians hailed it as the force that united East and West, binding a vast and diverse nation together. Writers described it in near-poetic terms as both a conqueror of distance and a destroyer of wilderness. The sight of rails cutting across prairies or winding through mountains was both inspiring and unsettling, a reminder that no corner of the land was beyond the reach of industry. For ordinary Americans in the 1880s, the railroad was simply part of life. A farmer might rise early to hitch a wagon and carry a load of grain to the depot. A storekeeper might scan the delivery of crates for long-awaited items. A child might watch from the fields as the morning train passed, wondering where its passengers were bound. The presence of the rails gave daily life a sense of movement and connection that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. And yet, for all its progress, the railroad also raised questions. Was this web of steel making life better for everyone, or was it concentrating power in the hands of a few corporations? Did the speed of the locomotive enhance community, or erode the slower rhythms of local life? For those standing on wooden platforms in the 1880s, watching a plume of smoke vanish into the horizon, the answer was far from clear. By the 1880s, the railroad was more than a means of travel or transport. It had become one of the most powerful institutions in America, shaping not just where people lived or how goods were moved, but also how wealth and influence were distributed across the nation. To the average farmer or small-town merchant, the railroad was both a lifeline and a looming presence, an engine of progress that could also bring hardship and resentment. The rise of the railroad corporations reflected the broader transformation of the American economy in the late 19th century. Unlike the small, family-run businesses that dotted rural landscapes, railroads required enormous capital, coordination, and infrastructure. They were among the first true corporations in America, giant enterprises that spanned states, employed thousands of workers, and operated with a scale that was almost unimaginable at the time. These corporations wielded power not only because of their size, but also because they controlled access. A farmer with wheat to sell, or a merchant with goods to order, had little choice but to use the nearest rail line. If rates were high, if service was poor, if schedules were inconvenient, there was often nothing to be done. Alternatives were few, and for many, non-existent. In this way, the railroad acted as a kind of gatekeeper, mediating between local communities and the wider world. Rates, in particular, became a flashpoint. Railroads often practiced what was known as rate discrimination. Large shippers, who could send hundreds of tons of grain or livestock, received significant discounts. Small farmers, by contrast, paid higher rates per bushel or per animal. Sometimes, railroads charged different prices for the same distance, favoring certain towns or industries over others. These practices bred resentment, especially among farmers, who already faced uncertain crop prices and mounting debts. The issue was not only economic but psychological. Many farmers felt they were losing control over their own labor. They could plow, sow, harvest, and sweat under the sun. But the reward for all that effort was determined not just by nature, but by distant men in corporate offices. Rail executives. Who set rates? Bankers, who set interest, and traders in far-off cities who determined market prices. The independence that farming was supposed to embody felt increasingly compromised. This discontent found expression in organized movements. The Grange, founded in the 1860s as a social and educational group for farmers, became a political force in the 1870s and 1880s, pressing for regulation of railroads. In some states, so-called Granger laws were passed, setting maximum freight and passenger rates. Railroads resisted, challenging these laws in court, and a series of legal battles ensued. The U.S. Supreme Court at first upheld the right of states to regulate railroads in Munn v. Illinois, 1877. But later decisions, such as Wabash v. Illinois, 1886, limited that power, declaring that only the federal government could regulate interstate commerce. The outcome of these struggles reflected a broader reality. Railroads were not just businesses, but institutions with deep political influence. Railroad companies lobbied legislatures, contributed to campaigns, and sometimes even dictated where towns and cities would rise. A line laid through one community could bring prosperity. A line bypassing another could doom it to obscurity. Local newspapers of the 1880s are filled with reports of towns petitioning or pleading for rail connections, knowing their future depended on it. Commerce itself was transformed by the reach of the rails. Goods that had once been luxuries became accessible in ordinary towns. Clothing, tools, furniture, and canned foods could all be shipped efficiently, and general stores became conduits for items that had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles. Catalogs, especially those of Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward, flourished because of railroads, which enabled delivery of everything from kitchen utensils to bicycles to watches. For many families, the arrival of a package ordered from a catalog was as exciting as a holiday, a tangible sign of connection to the modern world. But this accessibility carried a paradox. Local artisans, cobblers, and small manufacturers found themselves competing with mass-produced goods shipped in bulk. A local blacksmith who made tools might see demand decline when factory-made alternatives arrived by train at lower prices. Small-town economies were increasingly tied to forces they could not control, and the old self-sufficiency of rural life was slowly eroded. For railroad workers themselves, the industry was both a source of opportunity and exploitation. Tens of thousands labored as track layers, brakemen, firemen, engineers, and conductors. their work was often dangerous. Brakemen, in particular, risked their lives by climbing atop moving cars to manually operate brakes, a task that frequently led to injuries or deaths. Engineers and firemen contended with boiler explosions and long hours. Strikes and labor disputes became common as workers sought better pay, safer conditions, and shorter hours. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, just a few years earlier, had demonstrated the explosive potential of this discontent, as workers walked off the job in protest of wage cuts, leading to violent clashes with state militias and federal troops. Though the strike predated the 1880s, its memory lingered, reminding both workers and employers of the fragile balance between labor and management in the railroad industry. Throughout the decade, smaller strikes and disputes continued, underscoring the tension between those who operated the trains and those who controlled them at the same time. The railroad corporations became symbols of the broader rise of big business in America. Figures such as Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Collis P. Huntington became notorious, celebrated by some as visionary leaders and condemned by others as robber barons who amassed fortunes at the expense of ordinary people, their control over rail networks meant that they not only influenced commerce, but also wielded power in politics, shaping laws and policies to suit their interests. The reach of the railroads extended beyond economics into culture. Travel itself became a more common experience. Middle-class families could take excursions to cities, resorts, or fairs that would have been impractical without rail. Tourism grew, with destinations such as the Adirondacks or Yellowstone becoming accessible to those who could afford tickets. Students traveled to universities by rail. Soldiers were transported to and from bases, and immigrants moved westward in search of opportunity. Yet, despite the apparent democratization of movement, inequality was visible in the cars themselves. Wealthy passengers enjoyed plush Pullman sleepers with fine upholstery and dining service, while poorer travelers crowded into emigrant cars bare wooden coaches with little comfort. Just as the railroad expanded opportunity, it also highlighted divisions of class and wealth. For rural communities, the sense of dependence deepened. Farmers, shopkeepers, and townspeople might gather at the depot with excitement, but beneath the surface there was often a quiet resentment, excitement for what the train brought, but unease about the power it represented. The train was not merely a machine of steel and steam. It was a symbol of authority, connecting small lives to vast networks they could not fully understand or influence. And so, the railroad in the 1880s was a paradox. It was a marvel of progress and a source of frustration, a channel of connection, and a reminder of dependence. It brought goods, news, and opportunity, but also debts, inequalities, and new forms of vulnerability. For the ordinary American, it was impossible to ignore, shaping choices and possibilities in ways both subtle and profound. As one stood on a wooden platform in the twilight, listening to the rails hum as a train approached, the question lingered. Was this network of steel truly serving the people, or were the people, in the end, serving the railroads? By the late 19th century, the railroad was no longer a novelty. It was a constant presence, so familiar that people sometimes forgot to notice its extraordinary nature. Yet, in towns both small and large, the railroad shaped the rhythm of daily life in ways that were quiet, persistent, and deeply human. The depot, for instance, was more than a place to board a train. In many towns, it was the central gathering spot. People came not only to travel, but to meet arrivals, send off loved ones, or simply watch the comings and goings. Children lingered near the tracks, counting cars as they rattled past. Shopkeepers timed their work around the delivery of goods. Farmers knew when to expect freight trains that would carry their produce to market. The depot was a clock, a stage, and a social center all at once. For families, the railroad often marked the transitions of life. A young man leaving for college, a daughter departing for marriage in another state, a soldier boarding a troop train. All these departures carried the weight of finality, and the depot became a place of tears, embraces, and quiet hopes. In return, the arrival of a train could bring reunions, surprises, or simple relief as a familiar face stepped off onto the platform. Even those who rarely traveled felt the influence of the trains. A farmer might never leave his county, yet the grain he grew traveled hundreds of miles to distant cities. A housewife in Kansas might serve her family canned peaches grown in California, shipped by rail across the continent. The sense of distance changed. The world seemed both larger, because one could imagine faraway places, and smaller, because those places now felt connected by a tangible thread of steel. Children, especially, grew up with the railroad as part of their imagination. Stories of adventure and travel often began with the whistle of a train. Toy trains appeared in shops, and young boys sometimes dreamed of becoming engineers, masters of the great machines that pulled endless strings of cars. For many, the first real sense of the world beyond their town came not from maps or books, but from watching the daily passage of trains to destinations unknown. The soundscape of towns also changed. Before railroads, villages were quiet except for voices, wagons, and the occasional church bell. With trains, there was the steady punctuation of whistles, the deep rumble of wheels, the clank of couplings, and the hissing of steam. These sounds became part of daily life, so familiar that they blended into the background, like the ticking of a clock. For travelers returning after years away, the whistle of a train approaching the depot was often the first sign they were home again. But the railroad also carried a certain unease. Accidents, though less frequent than in the early days, were not uncommon. Newspapers carried stories of derailments, collisions, or pedestrians struck at crossings. Funerals were sometimes attended by entire towns when a local worker was killed. In a railroad accident, the very power that made the trains so impressive also made them dangerous, a reminder of the fine line between progress and peril. There was also a quieter sorrow associated with the rails, the sense of parting. Families who might once have stayed together in one region began to scatter. A son could board a train for Chicago and never return. A daughter might travel westward and build a life that her parents only glimpsed in letters. The mobility offered by trains expanded horizons, but it also stretched the bonds of family and community, sometimes to the breaking point. Still, nostalgia often softened these realities. People spoke of the beauty of trains at dusk, their lanterns glowing as they curved across the horizon. Writers and poets used the image of the railroad as a metaphor for time, destiny, or the journey of life itself. Painters captured trains, steaming through valleys or climbing mountain passes, symbols of both industry and romance. Even ordinary diaries from the 1880s are sprinkled with notes about train rides, tickets purchased, or hours spent waiting at a station. For immigrants, the railroad offered a path into America itself. Many who landed at ports like New York or Boston quickly boarded trains that carried them inland to industrial cities or farming communities. Sitting in crowded coaches, they looked out at landscapes they had never imagined, landscapes that would soon become home. The memory of those journeys often lingered for a lifetime. The sound of the train forever linked with the promise of a new life by the close of the century. The railroad was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it was woven into the fabric of everyday life, taken for granted, like the weather or the turning of the seasons. Extraordinary because it continued to shape lives, economies, and imaginations in profound ways in the quiet of evening. As families sat on porches or gathered around lamplight, the faint whistle of a train might drift across the fields. Some would pause to listen, thinking of loved ones far away. Others would not notice, so accustomed were they to the sound. Yet, whether noticed or not, the railroad threaded its way through their lives, binding town to town, family to family, and past to future. And so, in the stillness of the 1880s, the question remained. When we think of progress, do we imagine the power of steel and steam, or the quiet ways those forces reshape our daily lives? Story 3. Threads of daily life, clothing, textiles, and the fabric of the 1880 SIFU were to step into a typical American town in the 1880s. But the practical wear of everyday people, clothing was not simply decoration, it was labor, economy, and identity, woven into the very rhythms of daily life. For most households, clothing began not in a shop but in the home. The hum of the treadle sewing machine was as familiar as the crackle of the hearth. The Singer sewing machine, widely sold on installment plans, had by the 1880s become a near fixture in many middle-class homes. Women stitched dresses, aprons, and shirts, patching old garments into new forms and extending the life of every piece of fabric. A boy might wear a shirt that had once belonged to his father, cut down to size, with patches carefully applied at elbows and cuffs. For those living on farms or in rural towns, clothing, dry goods stores displayed bolts of calico, wool, and muslin in muted colors, patterned prints, or plain cloth. A mother choosing fabric had to think not only of beauty but of durability. Could this material withstand washings, the wear of chores, the rough play of children? Bright colors faded quickly, so practicality often won out. Laundry was itself an ordeal, a weekly task that consumed entire days. Clothes were scrubbed by hand in washtubs, wrung out, and hung to dry in sun or frost alike. Starching, mending, and ironing followed, with heavy flat irons heated on stoves. Clothing was cherished, repaired, and handed down through families. A single good coat might last years, passed from one sibling to another until threadbare in towns and cities. However, the ready-to-wear industry was beginning to make its mark, could be purchased ready-made in shops or through catalogs. The famous Sears, Roebuck & Co. and Montgomery Ward mail-order catalogs offered Americans in remote areas a chance to buy dresses, work shirts, hats, and boots without leaving their homes. For some, the arrival of a package from Chicago was nothing short of magical, a cardboard box filled with garments stitched by unseen hands hundreds of miles away. Clothing was more than utility. It was also a marker of identity. Farmers wore durable denim or wool trousers with suspenders and broad-brimmed hats. Shopkeepers and clerks dressed in waistcoats, their shirts stiffly starched. Women's dresses often reached the floor with tightly fitted bodices, high collars, and layers of petticoats. In summer, straw hats shaded faces. In winter, shawls and heavy woolens provided warmth. Shoes were often the most expensive item, and children sometimes went barefoot in warmer months to save them from wear. For immigrants arriving in America, clothing often carried symbolic weight. A new suit purchased after months of labor might be the first sign of belonging, a way to appear American. For others, traditional garments remained a quiet link to home. Scandinavian women in rural communities sometimes wore kerchiefs like those of their homeland. Jewish immigrants arriving in New York might keep certain styles of headwear, blending old and new in subtle ways. Textiles also carried the memory of labor. The cotton in a shirt might have been grown in the American South, picked by hand, and processed in mills in New England. Wool might have been shorn in the Midwest, spun into yarn, and woven in a factory town. Each garment represented countless hours of human effort. Through fabric, to where a shirt was, in a way, to where the unseen work of many. Even the act of dressing was deliberate. Men laced boots, buttoned shirts with precision, and tied cravats or knotted bow ties. Women laced corsets, fastened dozens of buttons, and arranged hair with pins and combs. People of their place in society and their responsibilities for the day. Clothing, though often plain, also carried aspiration. A young man might save for months to buy a new hat, hoping it would make a good impression. A woman might spend evenings sewing a dress from a popular pattern, eager to wear it to church or a social gathering. The small luxuries of lace trim, a ribbon, or a piece of jewelry were cherished precisely because they stood out against the sameness of daily attire. By the end of the 1880s, the wardrobe of America reflected both change and continuity. The Industrial Revolution was transforming textiles, making fashion more accessible. Yet most people still lived in a world of hand sewing, patching, and practicality. What one wore was not just a matter of choice, but a reflection of labor, class, gender, and geography. And so, when we imagine the 1880s, we might ask, if clothing is the fabric of daily life, how much of what people wore was shaped by necessity, and how much by the quiet desire to be seen? If Section 1 showed you the everyday fabric of life, the patched shirts, the starched collars, and the calico dresses, then Section 2 draws you further into the subtle differences clothing revealed in society. In the 1880s, what one wore was not simply about protection from the elements. It was a quiet signal, a form of language, often understood without words. To understand this, imagine standing at a train station in 1885. The scene itself might seem ordinary: farmers waiting for the freight train, businessmen with satchels in hand, families returning from visits. Yet, if you looked carefully at their clothes, you could read their lives. The broadcloth suit of the traveling salesman, though perhaps shiny with wear, marked him as someone who lived on the road, always presenting himself to strangers. The denim trousers and worn boots of the farmer spoke of labor in the fields. The lace-trimmed bonnet of a woman revealed her attempts at modest fashion, while the simple cotton headscarf of another showed thrift. The wealthier classes, especially in cities, followed the dictates of fashion magazines imported from Paris or published in American cities. Journals like Godey's Lady's Book and Harper's Bazaar spread images of the latest styles, which middle-class women often adapted using home sewing patterns. Dresses were more than garments. They were architecture of the body. Women wore corsets to shape the waist, bustles to extend the silhouette at the back, and layers of petticoats to give volume. Fabrics such as silk, satin, or fine wool were desired, but rarely affordable for ordinary families. More often, imitations were created using cheaper blends, cotton dyed to mimic silk, or wool woven with synthetic sheen. For men of means, the uniform was the three-piece suit. Waistcoat, trousers, and coat were cut from the same fabric, often in dark shades of black, gray, or navy. A pocket watch, chain gleaming, might hang across the vest. Hats were essential, and the type of hat carried subtle meanings. The stiff, silk top hat for formal occasions, the rounded bowler for middle-class respectability, and the soft felt hat for more practical use. To appear in public without a hat was rare, almost improper, but clothing did not always reveal prosperity, could also reveal constraint. Factory girls in industrial towns wore sturdy, plain dresses of cotton, often covered by aprons, to protect from dust and grease. Their shoes, inexpensive and worn, had to endure long hours of standing at machines. For them, clothing was not expression but endurance, a way to withstand the grind of labor. Children's clothing mirrored the adult world in miniature, but with some differences. Young boys often wore dresses until the age of 5 or 6, a practical decision that made changing easier. Afterward, they graduated into short trousers with suspenders, while girls wore smaller versions of women's dresses. School photographs from the 1880s show rows of solemn faces framed by stiff collars and carefully brushed hair. Clothing worn neat, even if not new. In the South, climate dictated adaptations. Light cottons, linens, and straw hats were favored to endure the heat. In northern cities, heavy woolens and layered garments became necessities against long winters. Immigrants often brought with them styles from Europe, which gradually blended into American norms. German immigrants in the Midwest, for example, might retain certain styles of work jackets, while Italian newcomers in New York sometimes introduced brighter fabrics into neighborhoods, otherwise marked by darker tones. The rise of department stores in the 1880s also reshaped clothing habits. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, grand stores with tall windows displayed mannequins in fashionable attire. Middle-class shoppers could browse, touching fabrics and imagining a wardrobe beyond their means. For the first time, clothing began to carry the sense of mass appeal. Yet, for rural Americans, this world was distant. Mail-order catalogs offered a bridge, but waiting weeks for delivery lacked the immediacy of a city purchase. Uniforms also played their role in shaping identity. The postman in his government-issued coat and cap, the policeman with brass buttons, the railroad conductor with insignia of these stood out as recognizable figures, their clothing lending authority. Even domestic workers were marked by aprons, caps, or plain dresses that distinguished them from the families they served. It is worth noting, too, the gendered burden of clothing. Women's attire was more labor-intensive, both to wear and to maintain. A fashionable dress might have required dozens of buttons, multiple layers, and restrictive stays. Men's clothing, though formal, allowed greater ease of movement. Critics of the time, particularly early advocates for women's health reform, argued that corsets and bustles were impractical, even harmful. Yet fashion persisted, reinforced by social expectation. The symbolism of clothing stretched into rituals of life. A black armband signaled mourning, while full mourning attired old black fabrics, veils, and somber hats could last for months after the death of a loved one. Weddings required the best dress a woman owned, not always white, but often carefully preserved for years. Clothing accompanied life's milestones, marking transitions in quiet but enduring ways. Through these divides of wealth, gender, labor, and ritual, clothing in the 1880s became more than fabric. It was a mirror of society itself, revealing who belonged, who aspired, and who endured. The simplest shirt or dress held meanings layered like the garments themselves. And so, we might pause and ask if every garment of the 1880s carried such unspoken stories. How many of those voices have been lost to time, remembered only in faded photographs and forgotten stitches? By the late 1880s, clothing in America was no longer simply the product of needle and thread in a quiet parlor. The garments people wore were increasingly tied to vast industrial systems, factories spinning cotton, mills weaving wool, machines cutting patterns, and shops selling ready-made suits or dresses. Behind the familiar bustle of everyday attire, an enormous transformation was underway. The Industrial Revolution had already changed how Americans worked, traveled, and lived. Now it was shaping how they dressed. Earlier in the century, most households made much of their own clothing, often piecing together fabrics into serviceable, if plain, garments. By the 1880s, however, ready-made clothing was becoming more accessible, especially for men. A suit could be ordered from a catalog or purchased off the rack in a city store, cut to standard measurements. It might not fit as precisely as a tailor's creation, but it was affordable and quick. This change carried subtle consequences. A farmer's son in Kansas, dressed in a factory-made suit ordered through Montgomery Ward, might resemble a clerk in New York more than his own father had a generation earlier. Clothing was beginning to erase some regional distinctions, creating a shared sense of appearance across vast distances. Yet, even as clothing unified, it also reinforced new divisions between those who could afford quality tailoring and those who wore the cheapest mass-produced goods. For women, the shift came more slowly. Dresses were complex, requiring skilled cutting and sewing, and so home dressmaking remained common. Still, the availability of sewing patterns, distributed widely by companies like Butterick, meant that women across the country could replicate fashionable styles at home. A pattern shipped to a frontier town might be used to create a dress that echoed Parisian design, though made of local calico. It was a quiet blending of worlds, the global and the local, stitched together. advertising began to play its role as, well, illustrated catalogs and magazines did more than display garments. They sold aspiration. The engraved image of a woman in a fitted bodice and flowing skirt suggested not only fashion, but refinement, even respectability. Clothing became an emblem of belonging, a way for individuals to align themselves with broader cultural ideals. For many, it was not only about warmth or modesty, but about signaling identity in a rapidly changing society. Immigrant communities experienced this tension deeply. Newly arrived families often held onto traditional garments at first. Heads, work jackets, embroidered details that marked their homeland. Over time, however, pressure to blend in encouraged them to adopt American styles. A Polish laborer in Chicago might gradually trade his old country wool cap for a bowler hat, while his wife began to stitch dresses from American patterns. Yet, in the privacy of homes, fragments of old traditions remain. Shawls passed down, aprons embroidered with patterns recalling distant villages. Clothing was both a bridge and a boundary, a way to belong and a way to remember. The textile industry itself carried shadows. Cotton remained a staple fabric, its production tied to the lingering effects of slavery and the difficult sharecropping system in the South. Mills in New England, powered by water and later steam, drew women and children into long hours of labor, weaving fabric that would eventually become shirts, sheets, and dresses across the nation. Behind every garment in a store window lay the story of labor and scene, unacknowledged, but deeply woven into the threads. There were also the beginnings of a shift in how clothing connected to politics and social reform. Advocates for the dress reform movement argued against restrictive corsets and heavy layers, proposing looser, healthier garments for women. Though these ideas remained marginal in the 1880s, they planted seeds for future change. Clothing, once viewed as entirely private, was slowly being recognized as a public question linked to health, equality, and freedom of movement. As the decade drew to a close, the look of the 1880s began to evolve. The exaggerated bustles that had defined much of women's fashion gradually diminished. Men's suits settled into a style more recognizable to the modern in narrower cuts, simpler lines, darker fabrics. Children's clothing became slightly more practical, with less emphasis on miniature versions of adult fashion. These were small adjustments, but together they marked the continuous shifting rhythm of dress. What remains striking when you step back is how much clothing in the 1880s served as both ordinary necessity and historical marker. Every seam, every choice of fabric told a story of industry, of gender roles, of aspiration, of labor. A patched pair of overalls on the prairie held as much meaning as a silk gown on Fifth Avenue. Both garments were shaped by the same era. Both carried the weight of their owners' lives, and both reflected the larger systems of economy and culture. Even today, traces of the 1880s linger in your own wardrobe. The tailored suit, the mass-produced dress, the importance of seasonal fashion, the quiet signaling of status through what one wears. All of these have roots in that transformative decade. You may not feel the weight of a corset or adjust the frame of a bustle, but the expectations and patterns shaped then continue to ripple outward. And so, as we leave behind the garments of the 1880s, perhaps the question lingers if our clothes today are still carrying the echoes of that century. What quiet signals are we sending forward, messages that future generations may one day read in our own forgotten fabrics? Story 4. Meals and Manners. Eating in an 1880s household. When you picture an American kitchen in the 1880s, it is not the brightly lit, gadget-filled room you might imagine today. Instead, it was often a modest, functional space defined by heavy wooden furniture, simple shelving, and, above all, the stove. The cast-iron cookstove was the centerpiece of nearly every household by this decade, a piece of technology that had transformed cooking from the open hearth of earlier generations. It provided a controlled surface for boiling, frying, and baking, though controlled was a relative term. Temperatures were gauged not by precise dials, but by experience, by the cook's ability to judge the heat of a stoveplate with a hand held nearby. The daily work of food preparation was immense. Without electricity, refrigeration, or running water in most homes, everything from storage to cooking demanded effort. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or packed in ice, hauled from frozen rivers in winter, and stored in sawdust-insulated icehouses. Vegetables were preserved through pickling, drying, or canning, though home canning was a risky endeavor. With spoilage and contamination a constant threat, the kitchen itself was rarely a quiet place. It was filled with the clatter of pots, the scrape of knives on wooden boards, the hiss of boiling water, and the smoky smell of coal or wood feeding the stove. In rural areas, women and older daughters shouldered much of this labor, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for men who would head to the fields or workshops. In cities, households with means might employ domestic servants, soften immigrant women whose work revolved around the stove, pantry, and scullery. Meals themselves were hearty, often simple, and shaped by what was available locally and seasonally. In New England, baked beans and brown bread remained staples. In the Midwest, pork, potatoes, and corn appeared in endless variations. In the South, biscuits, grits, and fried chicken found their place alongside greens stewed with ham, hocks. Immigrant communities added their own traditions. Italian families rolling pasta, German households preparing sausages, Chinese cooks introducing stir-fry techniques in California. Each table told a story, not only of sustenance, but of identity. Breakfast was perhaps the most substantial meal of the day for many Americans in the 1880s. It might include fried ham or bacon, eggs, biscuits, or cornbread, and coffee strong enough to carry workers through the morning. Dinner, served at midday, was the main meal, often consisting of roasted or stewed meat, potatoes, bread, and seasonal vegetables. Supper, lighter and eaten in the evening, might be leftovers, porridge, or bread with butter and preserves. This rhythm reflected a world still structured by daylight hours and physical labor, rather than by office schedules or electric light. The logistics of acquiring food were also significant. In rural areas, families depended on their own gardens, livestock, or local markets. Women churned butter, gathered eggs, and dried apples for winter storage. In cities, the marketplace was a lively and sometimes chaotic place, with butchers, grocers, and pushcart vendors offering everything from fresh fish to spices. The rise of packaged goods, flour, sugar, baking powder began to alter shopping habits, creating a new sense of convenience, though not yet anything approaching modern standards. cooking methods reflected both tradition and adaptation. Roasting a chicken required careful tending of the oven's heat. Baking bread was an all-day process, kneading dough by hand, allowing it to rise, and managing the stove's fickle warmth. Coffee was brewed strong and black, often boiled directly in a pot, while tea, favored by many immigrant families, was steeped in simple kettles. Alcohol remained common, with beer, cider, and whiskey part of everyday life. Though the temperance movement was beginning to spread its influence across towns and churches, meals were not only about food, but about labor, rhythm, and expectation. A woman might spend hours preparing a single meal, only for it to be eaten in minutes before family members returned to work. Yet these meals carried meaning beyond sustenance. They were moments of pause, of gathering, of maintaining social order. The family table reflected gender roles, economic means, cultural traditions, and even national identity. If you close your eyes and imagine the clatter of dishes, the smell of wood smoke, the warmth of bread pulled from a stove, you may begin to feel the quiet centrality of food in the 1880s. It was not fast, it was not simple, and it was never thoughtless. Every bite carried the weight of hours of unseen labor, and so one wonders, in an era when every meal required such care, did the food taste different, not in flavor alone, but in the meaning it held for those who prepared it and those who shared it? By the 1880s, the American table was as much about rules and appearances as it was about food. A meal was not simply an act of nourishment. It was also a performance, an opportunity to demonstrate refinement, propriety, and one's place in society. From the humblest farmhouse to the grandest urban mansion, the act of sitting down to eat carried with it layers of unspoken expectations in middle and upper-class households. Dining rooms had become increasingly distinct spaces. Earlier in the century, meals were often eaten in kitchens or multi-purpose rooms. But by the 1880s, a separate dining room was a mark of status. The heavy oak or mahogany table, polished sideboard, and often a chandelier or gaslight fixture set the stage. China cabinets displayed imported dishes, silver flatware, and crystal glassware, all symbols of respectability. Even families of modest means might purchase inexpensive versions of these items, eager to mirror the refinement they saw in wealthier circles. Etiquette books of the era, such as those by Florence Hartley or Thomas E. Hill, outlined in painstaking detail how meals should be conducted. The rules touched on everything from how to hold a fork to how to politely refuse a second serving. One was never to reach across the table, to eat too quickly, or to speak with one's mouth full. Napkins were to be unfolded discreetly and placed on the lap, not tucked into the collar. Soup, always a first course at formal dinners, was to be sipped from the side of the spoon. Never slurp but while etiquette may sound fussy, it played a real role in shaping society. For immigrants striving to assimilate, or for newly wealthy families attempting to establish themselves, mastering dining etiquette was a way to demonstrate belonging. A well-mannered dinner guest was seen as cultured, respectable, and worthy of social ties. At the family level, mealtime reinforced roles and hierarchy. The father often presided at the head of the table, carving the roast or pouring drinks. The mother managed the service, sometimes assisted by children or servants. Children were expected to be quiet, to eat what was placed before them without complaint, and to learn by observing the adults. In many households, meals were moments of moral instruction as much as physical nourishment. A poorly behaved child at the table was seen as a reflection of poor upbringing. For the wealthy, the dinner party was a stage of its own. Invitations were carefully chosen, seating arrangements deliberate. Multi-course meals, sometimes extending to 8 or 10 dishes, were common in fashionable circles. The progression from soup to fish to roasts to pastries and finally dessert reflected European influence, particularly French culinary traditions. Each course was served with a matching set of silverware, which guests were expected to use in the correct order, forks and knives placed outside in with each new dish. Servants played a vital role in these settings. Trained in discreet, quiet service, they removed and replaced plates, poured wine, and managed timing. The smooth running of a dinner party depended as much on their labor as on the host's planning. In contrast, in more modest households without servants, the mother often bore the responsibility of both preparing and serving each course, a task that could be exhausting when combined with the already heavy labor of cooking. Not all meals, of course, were so formal. In rural homes, supper might consist of bread, cold meat, and tea, eaten around a wooden table, worn from years of use. Yet even here, there was a sense of ritual: prayers before meals, shared silence as food was passed, and the expectation that the family would eat together. These daily gatherings, however simple, reinforced bonds and rhythms of life that stretched back generations. Interestingly, manners at the table also reflected broader cultural shifts. In the 1880s, there was growing anxiety about the pace of modern life, about railroads, telegraphs, and industrial expansion. The dining table became a place where order was restored, where rules were maintained, and where tradition anchored. Families against rapid change. The care given to proper behavior around a meal, even in the smallest details, reflected a society trying to hold on to stability in a world that was transforming quickly. In immigrant communities, meals were also acts of preservation. An Italian family in New York might gather around a table with pasta, garlic, and wine, maintaining traditions even as they adapted to American customs. A German family in the Midwest might continue to serve sausages, sauerkraut, and dark bread, while also learning to incorporate cornmeal or American-style pies. For many, the table was a place where old world met new world, where identity was negotiated as much as dinner was eaten. One can imagine the quiet intensity of these meals, the clink of silverware, the careful conversation, the pride in presenting a proper table, the invisible pressure of rules, both spoken and unspoken. For those who lived it, these rituals may not have felt extraordinary, but in their repetition, they reveal a society deeply invested in the meanings of food, order, and respectability. And it leaves us with a thought: if so much care was given to the performance of the table, what did it mean for those who did not or could not follow these rituals? How did class, poverty, or exclusion shape the experience of eating in an age where etiquette itself was a form of power? Story 5. Sickness on the trail. Ordinary illness. Extraordinary loss. When we imagine the Great Migration westward in the 1880s, it is tempting to picture endless horizons, wagon wheels creaking across dusty plains, and the dream of land waiting to be claimed. But if you had been one of the hundreds of thousands who traveled, what would have struck you more powerfully than the landscape was the ever-present shadow of illness on the trail. Sickness was not an occasional inconvenience, it was a constant companion. A headache could quickly become a fever, a cough could deepen into consumption, and what began as a stomachache might end a life within days. Unlike battlefields or natural disasters, where death came swiftly and dramatically, the illnesses of the trail crept in quietly, gnawed at the body, and left families making impossible choices to stop and risk falling behind or to keep moving and watch a loved one fade. One of the most feared afflictions was dysentery, often called the flux. Caused by contaminated water or spoiled food, it spread rapidly in wagon camps where dozens of families gathered near the same rivers or creeks. Diaries of emigrants repeatedly describe the misery. Children doubled over in pain, adults growing weaker with each day of dehydration and the near impossibility of caring for the sick when wagons still needed to move westward. Simple sanitation, boiling water, digging latrine trenches, separating waste from camp was not always understood, or, if understood, not always possible. In the rush of travel, cholera was another constant terror. Outbreaks struck with stunning speed. A person might feel well in the morning and be dead by nightfall, their body racked by vomiting, cramps, and unrelenting diarrhea. The disease thrived along popular migration routes, where streams and watering holes became contaminated by the very travelers who depended on them. During cholera years, entire stretches of trail were marked by fresh graves. Some emigrants, seeing the markers of those who had gone before, referred to the path west as a road of bones. Fevers, too, haunted the frontier. Malaria spread in low-lying areas near rivers, its chills and sweats sapping the strength of those who needed it most for the rigors of travel. Typhoid fever, spread through unclean water, brought high temperatures and delirium, and scarlet fever or measles, especially devastating among children, could pass through a wagon train like fire through dry grass. In many cases, medical knowledge was limited and doctors were scarce. Most families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, or whatever patent medicines they had packed before departure. Bottles of laudanum, a tincture of opium, were common and used liberally for pain, coughs, or even calming restless children. Calomel, a mercury-based purgative, was another popular cure, though it often poisoned as much as it healed. The very medicines intended to save lives could, in truth, hasten decline. What makes the story of sickness on the trail particularly haunting is not only the diseases themselves, but the context in which they struck. Imagine a family pausing their wagon beside the Platte River in Nebraska. One child is feverish, another begins to show the same symptoms, and the mother grows frantic. The father must decide whether to halt the wagon, risking the entire family's journey, or to push on, hoping that rest will come at the next encampment. At night, the sick are laid on blankets beneath canvas covers, their groans mixing with the sound of restless oxen. By morning, the family may be digging a shallow grave along the roadside, fashioning a cross from wagon scraps before moving on. The ordinariness of this tragedy is what sets it apart. These were not isolated disasters. They were woven into the very fabric of migration. Death was expected, to the point where guides for emigrants in the 1880s included instructions for burial. Wagons often carried a few simple tools: shovels, canvas, nails, because the need for a coffin or grave was a reality few could escape. The trail west became not only a corridor of movement, but also a corridor of mourning. And yet, despite the ever-present shadow of sickness, families kept going. Some carried memories of children lost at river crossings, of grandparents buried beneath prairie grass, or of a spouse who succumbed within sight of the mountains. Still, they pressed onward, drawn by the promise of land, opportunity, and a new start. Illness tested them, but it did not stop them in this way. The story of sickness on the trail is not just about disease, but about resilience. It shows us how ordinary people, armed with little more than determination and faith, confronted the fragility of life head-on. But this raises a question we must pause on. If disease was so common, what strategies, whether wise, desperate, or simply habitual, did families use to protect themselves? And how did these choices shape who survived and who did not on the long road west? Story 5. Sickness on the trail. Ordinary illness. Extraordinary loss. When we imagine the Great Migration westward in the 1880s, it is tempting to picture endless horizons, wagon wheels creaking across dusty plains, and the dream of land waiting to be claimed. But if you had been one of the hundreds of thousands who traveled, what would have struck you more powerfully than the landscape was the ever-present shadow of illness on the trail. Sickness was not an occasional inconvenience, it was a constant companion. A headache could quickly become a fever, a cough could deepen into consumption, and what began as a stomachache might end a life within days. Unlike battlefields or natural disasters, where death came swiftly and dramatically, the illnesses of the trail crept in quietly, gnawed at the body, and left families making impossible choices to stop and risk falling behind, or to keep moving and watch a loved one fade. One of the most feared afflictions was dysentery, often called the flux. Caused by contaminated water or spoiled food, it spread rapidly in wagon camps where dozens of families gathered near the same rivers or creeks. Diaries of emigrants repeatedly describe the misery. Children doubled over in pain, adults growing weaker with each day of dehydration and the near impossibility of caring for the sick when wagons still needed to move westward. Simple sanitation: boiling water, digging latrine trenches, separating waste from camp was not always understood, or, if understood, not always possible. In the rush of travel, cholera was another constant terror. Outbreaks struck with stunning speed. A person might feel well in the morning and be dead by nightfall, their body racked by vomiting, cramps, and unrelenting diarrhea. The disease thrived along popular migration routes, where streams and watering holes became contaminated by the very travelers who depended on them. During cholera years, entire stretches of trail were marked by fresh graves. Some emigrants, seeing the markers of those who had gone before, referred to the path west as a road of bones. Fevers, too, haunted the frontier. Malaria spread in low-lying areas near rivers, its chills and sweats sapping the strength of those who needed it most for the rigors of travel. Typhoid fever, spread through unclean water, brought high temperatures and delirium. and scarlet fever or measles, especially devastating among children, could pass through a wagon train like fire through dry grass. In many cases, medical knowledge was limited and doctors were scarce. Most families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, or whatever patent medicines they had packed before departure. Bottles of laudanum, a tincture of opium, were common and used liberally for pain, coughs, or even calming restless children. Calomel, a mercury-based purgative, was another popular cure, though it often poisoned as much as it healed. The very medicines intended to save lives could, in truth, hasten decline. What makes the story of sickness on the trail particularly haunting is not only the diseases themselves, but the context in which they struck. Imagine a family pausing their wagon beside the Platte River in Nebraska. One child is feverish, another begins to show the same symptoms, and the mother grows frantic. The father must decide whether to halt the wagon, risking the entire family's journey, or to push on, hoping that rest will come at the next encampment. At night, the sick are laid on blankets beneath canvas covers, their groans mixing with the sound of restless oxen. By morning, the family may be digging a shallow grave along the roadside, fashioning a cross from wagon scraps before moving on. The ordinariness of this tragedy is what sets it apart. These were not isolated disasters. They were woven into the very fabric of migration. Death was expected, to the point where guides for emigrants in the 1880s included instructions for burial. Wagons often carried a few simple tools: shovels, canvas, nails, because the need for a coffin or grave was a reality few could escape. The trail west became not only a corridor of movement, but also a corridor of mourning. And yet, despite the ever-present shadow of sickness, families kept going. Some carried memories of children lost at river crossings, of grandparents buried beneath prairie grass, or of a spouse who succumbed within sight of the mountains. Still, they pressed onward, drawn by the promise of land, opportunity, and a new start. Illness tested them, but it did not stop them in this way. The story of sickness on the trail is not just about disease, but about resilience. It shows us how ordinary people, armed with little more than determination and faith, confronted the fragility of life head-on. But this raises a question we must pause on. If disease was so common, what strategies, whether wise, desperate, or simply habitual, did families use to protect themselves? And how did these choices shape who survived and who did not on the long road west? If you were traveling westward across America in the 1880s, you would not have had the luxury of a doctor's office, a pharmacy on every corner, or even a clear understanding of what caused disease. Instead, survival rested on a patchwork of folk wisdom, home remedies, and the handful of patent medicines that emigrants carried in their wagons. One of the most important strategies for facing sickness was preparation before departure. Guides to overland travel, often published in the East, advised families on what to pack. Alongside food staples like flour, bacon, and beans, emigrants were told to bring small stores of medicine. A tin of quinine might be carried to ward off ague, the periodic fevers of malaria. Laudanum, an opiate tincture, was used for pain, diarrhea, cough, or even to help the exhausted sleep. Calomel, a mercury-based purgative, was considered a cruel, though its side effects were often severe: bleeding gums, salivation, and long-term poisoning. Most families also relied on what they already knew, remedies passed down through generations. Herbal teas made from peppermint, chamomile, or ginger were brewed for stomach complaints. A poultice of mustard seed might be applied to the chest to ease coughing. Whiskey or brandy was kept not only as a stimulant but also as a disinfectant for wounds. Vinegar, when available, was used for fevers or as a cleanser. These treatments, while simple, gave families a sense of agency against illnesses that otherwise seemed unstoppable. Beyond remedies, ritual and belief played a role. Prayer was a near universal response to sickness. In camp, it was not uncommon for emigrants to gather and pray for the recovery of a child or spouse. Some families read from the Bible at the bedside, drawing comfort from words that framed suffering within the larger story of faith. Others sought meaning in signs and omens. A sudden storm might be read as divine displeasure, or a brief recovery as evidence of answered prayer. Communal care also mattered. Wagon trains were not only collections of individual families, they were interdependent communities. When someone fell ill, neighboring families often pitched in, offering spare blankets, sharing food, or taking turns watching over the sick. Children were carried from wagon to wagon when parents were too exhausted to keep up. In cases where death was unavoidable, entire trains sometimes paused for burial, forming impromptu funeral gatherings on the plains. These rituals, though brief, gave a sense of dignity to lives lost along the trail. Yet the remedies and rituals were not always enough. Misunderstanding the causes of disease often made matters worse. People knew little about bacteria or viruses. The germ theory of disease, though gaining acceptance in medical circles by the 1880s, had not reached most emigrants. They believed, instead, in miasmas, bad air, or foul odors thought to spread illness. This belief shaped their actions. Some burned sage or juniper to cleanse the air. Others moved camp if the smell of stagnant water became strong. While such measures occasionally reduced exposure to disease, they often offered only false reassurance, despite the limits of their knowledge. Emigrants did adapt strategies that showed remarkable resourcefulness. Water, for example, was carefully chosen when possible. Families drew from clear running streams rather than stagnant pools. Some boiled water, though fuel was often too precious to waste. Food was inspected for signs of spoilage. Though on long journeys, desperation sometimes forced families to consume questionable supplies. Clothing was washed when rivers allowed, and bedding aired out to drive away dampness and lice. Each small step, though far from modern standards, helped reduce risk. Another element of survival was endurance itself. Families learned to carry on through prolonged sickness, adapting their routines around illness. Wagons were rearranged to allow the weak to lie flat. Children were assigned tasks like fetching water or gathering firewood when adults were bedridden. Stronger emigrants pulled double loads, not only their own wagons, but also those of neighbors incapacitated by fever. This resilience, though exhausting, kept trains moving westward despite relentless setbacks. Even so, choices on the trail often carried impossible weight. If a loved one grew too ill to travel, families faced the dilemma of halting, risking the journey. Supplies and safety of the group were moving on, leaving the sick behind. In some cases, emigrants were left at small settlements, military forts, or missionary outposts entrusted to strangers. For those who died on the open prairie, graves were hastily dug and disguised, sometimes hidden beneath wagon tracks or scattered brush to prevent animals from disturbing the site. Every remedy, every ritual, and every decision reveals the thin margin between survival and loss. What is striking is not simply the suffering, but the quiet persistence of families who carried on, day after day, through pain and uncertainty. These ordinary strategies, mixing herbs, offering prayers, sharing burdens, were acts of resilience that allowed thousands to complete the journey. But this persistence leads us to wonder, what was the emotional cost of carrying so much sickness, death, and grief across the miles of the American frontier? How did emigrants bear the weight of continual loss without surrendering to despair? Imagine the silence that followed a burial on the open prairie. The wagon train, which only hours before had been bustling with the sounds of movement creaking wheels, struck the earth. There was no marble marker, no churchyard, no stone wall to frame the moment. A grave might be nothing more than a mound of soil, a rough wooden cross, or sometimes no marker at all. For emigrants in the 1880s, sickness did not only threaten survival, it continually reshaped the emotional fabric of families. The journey west was meant to be a path toward promise new farms, opportunities, or freedom from the crowded and often harsh realities of the East. Yet, along that path, illness could undo years of planning in a matter of days. A mother might succumb to childbed fever shortly after giving birth on the trail, leaving a newborn to be raised by relatives. A father might be lost to cholera, leaving the family without its strongest guide. Vulnerable, death often came swiftly, creating a hollow space in wagons that once overflowed with noise and laughter. Mourning practices were necessarily brief. Prayers were spoken at the graveside, often led by a minister, if one traveled with the group, or otherwise by a family member. Hymns might be sung, voices carried by the wind over the open plains. Afterward, the living turned back to the road, their grief folded into the routine of travel. For many, the sheer demand of the journey left little room for prolonged mourning. The wagons had to move. Livestock needed tending. Water had to be found. Carried memory forward in quiet ways. A child's name might be carved into the side of a wagon, or a small keepsake kept hidden in a trunk. Some emigrants kept diaries, where entries about illness and loss were woven into descriptions of rivers crossed and mountains climbed. These journals reveal the deep sorrow hidden beneath the steady march westward. Communities also remembered together. Stories of who had been lost on the trail were retold around campfires or in new settlements once the journey was over. These stories preserved the names of the fallen, ensuring they were not erased by distance. In many pioneer towns, founders, families included those who had buried kin along the way, their grief tied inseparably to the place they finally settled. Illness also left a legacy in the caution it inspired. Survivors carried with them hard-won lessons to guard water sources carefully, to keep bedding dry, to store herbs for fevers, and to remain vigilant in the face of faint symptoms. These lessons became part of frontier culture, shaping how communities in the West thought about health, disease, and resilience. What is perhaps most striking is the endurance of hope in the face of so much loss. For every grave along the trail, there was also the persistence of families who pressed onward, even in grief. They carried the belief that the destination held meaning, that the sacrifices of those who had fallen would not be in vain. This quiet resilience formed the backbone of countless settlements in the West, towns built not only from wood and stone, but from the memories of those carried in silence. Looking back, we can see how sickness on the trail reshaped the story of westward expansion. It was not only about wagons, landscapes, or new beginnings. It was about how ordinary people endured extraordinary loss and continued onward despite it. The graves that dotted the prairies and mountain passes were not merely markers of tragedy. They were also testaments to the resilience of families who found the strength to go on in the end. The story of illness on the trail reminds us that history is not only shaped by great battles or political decisions, by the quiet persistence of those who faced hardship, bore grief, and carried on. Their endurance left a legacy not inscribed in monuments, but in the survival of families who reached their destinations and built new lives in the West. And so, today, do we truly remember the weight of sickness and sorrow carried by those who walked the trail, or do we prefer to let their graves fade into the landscape, unseen but not forgotten?